Hello, everybody. Welcome to the interview component of the Gum Road. I'm here with my friend Stanley Von Medvey.
Hello.
Stanley Stanley is an illustrator, animator, storyboard artist, filmmaker, and expert on all things space, living in LA at the moment. I just wanted to get Stan on because he is just a crazy font of knowledge about all sorts of things. And I actually I pulled a bit of a dirty trick on him. We were doing just a general phone call about work, and I thought this is so interesting. I'm just going to push record, and what I recorded is what you will hear in a few minutes. I just thought it was this is something I want to put out there. So I'm sorry for doing that to you, Stan. It was a bit of a cheap shot, but thank you so much for playing along. I appreciate it.
Oh, sure. My pleasure. It's great.
So you're doing a blog at the moment, a video blog called Stan Draws Spaceships at the minute, where you put your filmmaking expertise and space knowledge into one place. What can people expect when they visit that?
Well, it's just a short. It's good. Well, right now there's one video, but it's going to be a series of short videos, probably no more than 2 minutes, of just these little squiggly lined animations, black and white animations, and my voiceover, and I'm just explaining basic principles of spaceflight, and just sort of the neat ideas that go into the engineering to get things into orbit. Because I'm endlessly fascinated by it. I'm constantly learning, little details that I feel like have to be shared. And so I thought, well, what better way to do that than to make simple animations and just talk about it. And yeah, so that's what you'll see. Stan
Awesome.
draws spaceships.
So if people search Stan Draws Spaceships, that should just come straight up. You have your own site, www.stanleyvonmedvey.com, with all of your work. I suggest people go and check it out. There's all sorts of bits and bobs, film clips, and you've made a short movie, an amazing science fiction short movie, just sort of off in your free time. Incredible work. I mean, thanks very much for coming on and talking. Um, and I hope you can hear what a pleasant voice Stan has as well, in contrast to my abrasive English accent. So settle back
Oh,
and
not abrasive at all. I think you underestimate your own radio voice. I think it's pretty solid.
oh, you you can definitely come back on this show. All right, well, everybody sit back and relax. And the answers Stan gives are absolutely fascinating. So see what you think. It all felt so naturalistic and so well studied. I couldn't tell
Yeah.
whether the writers were just brilliant, practiced students of human behavior, or they were just kind of writing, off the top of their head. Or it was, I imagine it's the former because they made it look so easy, but it felt like they weren't
Yeah.
belaboring it at all. There was no um, this kind of dull, this guy and then
Well,
this guy and then this guy and then this guy. It's just like just offhandedly refers to these incredible things that are beyond comprehension and then moves on. Fantastic. I
it's
love that.
I think it's for that reason that I'd really like to read a physical copy of it because
Yeah.
something that I noticed, if you've never done this, it's just like an instant respect builder for writers, for great writers,
Hmm.
is take a movie that you love, that you
Hmm.
really, really love, like a great film where the performances are natural and everything's incredible, right? And it's just
Hmm.
perfectly harmoniously put together, and read the script. Read the script to it. And because when you're watching and listening,
Hmm.
uh, it's just like editing, right? The naturalism becomes invisible, right?
Right.
But
Right. Yeah.
but for some reason, and sometimes even when you're reading a book, the naturalism becomes invisible. But a script, a screenplay, where it's clear, like now this person says this, now that person says that, and you actually see what's written,
Hmm.
like what they've actually written to say, uh, and you really get a much better sense of like, okay, where is it the actor and director are coming in, and where is it that the screenplay is just fucking brilliant? There have
Yeah.
been a few screenplays I've read where uh, there's different philosophies about how to write screenplays. So some people write screenplays where what's being said is not inflected, right? The inflection and all the sort of like nuance is supposed to be given is supposed to come out of the director working with the actors, right?
Right, right.
But there's some screenplays where every pause, every stutter is written.
Kind of Pinter always did that when we were forced to read his plays in school, and yeah, he planned out every conversational pause as if he was listening to it in
Right.
his mind and writing it down. Interesting.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And those people, those are the ones who do. So my good friend Tom, he would tell me all kinds of interesting exercises that he would do. Like one exercise that great screenwriters do is they go to a cafe and they just act like stenographers to every conversation happening around them. They just listen in and just write down exactly what's being said, how it's being said. So that they understand. It's just like a study, right?
Yeah,
Like you're
yeah.
you're just getting a sense of what it's like to write naturally, to write the way someone else talks,
Because
right?
that's so not the case in loads of films. Normally, people start a sentence and they know exactly how they're going to finish it. Whereas in real life, you talk like I've just done now. I wasn't really sure where I was going to go with the sentence. I knew what I wanted to say, but sometimes you
Right.
come at it from different angles. I mean, you watch something like Tim and Eric, and they really go for those weird awkwardnesses that everyone else runs away from, and it makes their stuff so strange and so funny. I think.
Well, and it comes from the author. This is in that Laho Segre book, that Art of Dramatic Writing, which I really love. It comes from the writer understanding that language is playing a game of catch up with the very solid internal motivations of the character. So if you
Right.
understand what the character is trying to get out of the conversation as a whole, then you're sort of running a simulation, a back and forth, right?
Yeah.
Because everyone is unconsciously steering a conversation, right? And and when two people are holding a conversation, their motivations are always slightly misaligned, right? And so that stutter, that natural kind of beat comes out of the attempt to align either one's to align the other with their own motivation. You know what I mean? And if you get real good at that, you can write that really naturally, and it's awesome. It's
So
really
you
cool
think
to
it really
see.
is a practice skill rather than it's like someone making it look easy rather than it just being easy. I mean,
Yeah,
whenever you try,
yeah.
if
There
talking
there
about
may be some
actors and
talents out
directors,
there, but I think it's
yeah,
practiced.
talking about actors and directors is a really great example when we were talking before about the difference between LA Takedown and Heat, because you can watch if you put them side by side in like a YouTube, two different windows in YouTube, you can watch the same scene being played by two TV quality actors and then two of the greatest actors of the 20th century, and they
Oh
almost
wow.
exactly the same lines, but the scenes are so different because the actor brings so much personality and so much of his own
Yeah.
idea of the character to the lines. It's really interesting to watch that. How Michael Mann made this prototype version, and then the real thing 20 years later with all of this new stuff that he'd learned, and these two incredible actors made an amazing difference.
Well, what's interesting too is how much. So that reminds me of this thing that I didn't know but until very recently that Joan told me about, which is about in voice acting and animation. Is that in the U.S. you record you have the script, and what you do is you do all the voice acting first, right? You have rough storyboards, and then you do voice acting to the rough storyboards, and then the animators work to your voice,
Right,
right?
right.
Because you're bringing some performance, you're bringing some life, and so then the animator then gets to kind of it's like two people acting the
Right.
character,
Yeah.
right? Whereas in Japan, they do all the animation all the way to final first, and then the voice, not always final, but pretty close, like and then what they'll do is they'll right, they'll act while they're watching it. So the animation is informing. In other words, I mean, there's a balance there. It's not always perfect, but in Japan they lean more heavily on animation informing the actor and in the U.S. they lean more heavily on the actor informing
I
the
didn't know that.
animation.
That's really interesting. I mean, certainly
Yeah.
across language barriers, you get this um, an interesting kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Like reading Solaris, for example, compared to Roadside Picnic. I thought the Roadside Picnic translation was amazing. It was like all translated into this very believable American sort of language, whereas
Yeah.
Solaris, it was written in a very kind of workmanlike English, which I quite like actually. And the same with a lot of subtitles from Japanese programs. I mean, it's quite different what they say in the subs to what they're actually saying if you understand Japanese. I think I get that
Yeah.
impression that there's this kind of
Oh,
big difference between the two. But I always quite like the way they talk in these subs because they're so workmanlike. They're not trying to be flashy. They're just saying the basic meanings of the words, and I always kind of made them
yeah.
characters
You.
kind of
You.
likable and businesslike in the way they talk. I don't know. It kind of gives them character in itself.
No, it's absolutely true. I actually I had a really striking experience with Ghost in the Shell recently, where I had watched I had watched Ghost in the Shell many times in my life, and then recently, and every time I'd watched it, I'd seen subtitles, these like the like original pass at the subtitles.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? The original translation, like the first time when they pass it over. So I'd always seen that. I recently saw a retranslated version of Ghost in the Shell where they had gone to much greater lengths to not localize, but to really transfer the meaning over.
Hmm.
You know, like they it was like a you can tell that they've just gone to a bigger fuss of like
Right.
trying to capture the original meaning and it really changed the film. It really changed the film
Wow.
because there were certain beats in the original when I was watching it that kind of felt stilted or a little bit awkward or a little like, for example, that whole scene where Kusanagi is sitting on the boat,
Mhm.
right? And she's talking, she's kind of having this like existential
Yeah.
conversation, right?
Yeah.
With right that whole scene. When I watched it initially, just reading the lines and reading kind of everything that had led up to it, I always thought that scene seemed sort of out of place. Like she was just sort of robotically muttering off a bunch of philosophy,
Yeah,
right?
that I know what you mean because the Ghost in the Shell translation and English version is in fact one of the better ones, isn't it? The actors are pretty good, and it
Right,
doesn't have
right,
that normal anime lack of pauses, as if they've edited all the pauses out of the sentences. So they have this run-on sentences that never have any pauses and they never take a breath and it never sounds natural, kind of thing. But that one scene
right.
where she's sitting in the boat, it did sound like she was reading off a page of notes or something. I completely understand what you mean there. Although that is one of the key scenes in the film, definitely.
Right. Well, so what was interesting was that it felt that way even when she's speaking Japanese and you were reading
Hmm.
English subtitles. However, with the better translation, I'm calling it the better translation because of the impact it
Hmm.
had. It no longer felt like she was reading off a line of notes. It felt like she was having a real awake crisis,
Wow.
and it blew my mind. I was like, "Holy fuck, this film is amazing!"
How can I
like
find this? This sounds like something I want to check out.
I will try to dig it up because I was never able to find it
Oh,
again.
okay.
And so I'm gonna put it because I've been trying to show a friend of mine for a while, and I gotta find this fucking thing. It's like a Blu-ray torrent somewhere, and I need to find this translation. I'll find when I get my hands on it. I'll be sure to send it to you.
Definitely.
But it really like it was almost like watching. It was almost like rediscovering Ghost in the Shell and realizing that like this is the quintessential perfect, creepy
Oh,
AI
yeah. I mean,
existential
it's
facing
it's it's
everything
it's
film.
funny you say that because I obviously watched it as a kid, and I remember James Cameron said it was the definitive kind of serious science fiction animated film to watch, and I obviously think he's an amazing genius. So I watched it as a young guy, and then older and older, and more into it, and then kind of thought I've seen enough of it. saturated culture so much that, I don't ever want to see a kind of robot girl
Right.
with pipes coming out of her back ever again. It's just not interesting to me anymore.
Right.
But
Right.
then I watched a video recently by, I've got it up on my screen actually, Anime Every Day, Ghost in the Shell Analysis, Motoko's Dilemma. And it's like you say, it really does explore each scene and the symbolism in the scene in things that I'd never noticed before. And it really does give you that kind of
Yeah.
eyes wide shut thoroughness, the
Right.
Kubrickian style detail that's put into this. I mean, I already thought it was an amazing and beautiful and interesting and serious film, with enough
Right.
fan service to keep, kind of youngsters interested, which is exactly what I liked about it in the first place, the kind of sci-fi elements and the cop elements and
Right.
stuff. But no, I'd never really noticed before how much, genius basically there is in this thing, how much depth there is.
Yeah.
It was really something.
Yeah. It was one of those, like, when you look at the source material, the manga, right,
Mm-hmm.
and you see Masamune Shirow, like Shiro's original work is really masturbatory in both the sexual dimension and just the, like, I want to show you how much, almost the way Charles Stross writes, where it's like, let me show you how smart I am.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Certainly early
And
on, I get what you mean with Strauss being like that. He's clearly sat in his office for years and years coming up with these ideas and wanting to put them into a book, and then he has put them into a book. And it's only in the later stories where he's really starting to relax into being a serious writer and let that
right,
go a bit, that he becomes more readable, I
right,
think.
right, right, right. Yeah, agreed, absolutely. So Shiro, that's sort of the vibe I always got with Shiro, and then you know, seeing how Mamoru Oshii handles shit, it's almost like, because he did this with Pat Labor and Pat Labor 2,
Mm-hmm.
and then with this, have you ever seen Avalon, his live action film?
Yeah, the one that's set in sort of Eurostan or something. It's some sort of a virtual
It's
reality
it's in Poland.
Poland.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah.
He shot it in Poland, and it's all in Polish. It's
Yeah.
awesome.
I didn't realize that
So
was a
so
Japanese production, actually. I thought that was a kind of Eastern European. Okay, interesting.
I
I
th-
have seen it,
I
though,
thought
yeah.
so too. Yeah, no, that's Mamoru Oshii.
Huh.
He directed that shit, and it has quite a few flaws for a live action film, but you get the sense that he's one of these guys who's like, okay, you want guns, you want explosions, you want boobs, all of you. Well, you're not going to get it without leaving changed.
Right,
You know what I mean?
right.
Like, I'm gonna wrap this pill in this ham.
That's interesting.
You
So you
know?
think that's kind of just his accepted cost of doing business? Like you have to give people a bit of boobs and a bit of gunplay to get them interested? Because I know it worked on me. It's,
Right?
with
No, yeah,
Evangelion
same.
as well. I was brought in by the kind of, the girls and the robots, and by the end I was obviously completely changed as a person, and all of that stuff becomes comical, and you see how silly it all is to be obsessed with stuff like that by the end of something like Evangelion,
Yeah,
or Ghost in the Shell. Interesting. Huh.
yeah, absolutely. I think even a movie like Paprika does it a bit, at least in the marketing materials, right? Like ooh, it's this cute girl. It looks like kind of psychedelic,
Yeah.
and
Yeah,
ooh.
she's not an ugly
And then
girl,
no,
is she? She's not like some goofy looking guy. She's a hot girl.
no,
That's interesting because I always thought that in the middle period when I'd kind of gone out of love with Ghost in the Shell and so on, I sort of thought I was seeing through that, and they were just kind of juvenile. And now that you explain it that way, I start to think that you're right, that it's just a way of tricking people into, particularly young guys who wouldn't otherwise be interested in this stuff, into watching stuff that's improving for them.
yeah, I think so. I absolutely think that they're sufficiently sensitive, considered minds.
Mm.
These people that they would utilize a trick like that. And you look at a movie like Ex Machina, it absolutely does that too.
Shamefully, I haven't seen
You
that
know?
yet, although I hear it's worth seeing. So that's on my list.
Oh, it's a perfect representation of the air gap problem. Like, someone took the air gap problem of AI
Hmm.
and made it into a
Oh, really?
film.
Like we were talking about the other day, re superintelligence, how you would stop it from escaping.
Yeah,
Huh. Okay.
Yep, exactly. It's just like a slightly allegorical, because it's a beautiful woman robot,
Right,
right?
right.
Not a server in a room. So it's a slightly allegorical, just visualizing of the air gap problem
Hmm.
perfectly, beautifully, like just and in that, in what you want out of a sci-fi, which is you're pulled in by the sexy robots, and you leave, staring at your hands and going, "What am I?" And
That sounds up my
which
street.
is
That sounds perfect. I mean, I completely think that there would be and will be sexy robots because that's exactly what's always been depicted in film and cartoons. And the people who
yeah,
will build these things and are building them are often geeky guys who
yep,
like sexy robots. So it's almost like in Terminator when the Skynet was designing these terror weapons to terrify humans in the film. Was doing
yep.
exactly the same job that Cameron was doing, designing these terrifying monsters to terrify audiences. It's almost like this, there's a crossover there.
No, I agree. I mean, I know a lot of engineers, and it sometimes I have to remind myself that engineers are not spending all their time analyzing art. They're spending
Yeah,
all their time being great
right.
engineers. And so when I roll my eyes and I see a guy who's like, "Yeah, I built a working R2D2." Oh, for fuck's sake! Like I have to remember he's not in Artland. You know, like to him, R2D2 is something visited infrequently enough that it's still
Right.
interesting.
Yeah. Okay.
And this is where I think people roll their eyes when they talk about emotional
Mm.
intelligence, but I actually think that that's a personally I think it's an enormous domain of overlooked
Oh.
knowledge, which is just simply the capacity to be aware of your internal senses, the motivations for your
Hmm.
emotions, and those and others, and pay attention to it and be good at it. You can become an emotional Michael Jordan,
Yeah, that's
and
interesting.
people don't even realize that's a spectrum you can move on,
I mean, if,
right?
if the human mind is the most complicated thing in the universe, which it seems to be as far as we know so far, then that
Hmm.
knowledge is the most complicated science, if you like, isn't it? It
Yeah,
makes it makes maths and physics and stuff look trivial by comparison, in
right,
complexity.
right, exactly. Like, and it's amazing how people, like simple shit, right? Like you're in traffic, and you find yourself tailgating a person in front of you, right? Uh, at 70 miles an hour, some fucking van full of
Hmm.
kids, you know what I mean? And you're flashing your high beams like it's goddamn 24-hour Le Mans, you know what I mean? And and you have to sit there and go, like, when I see that, and I used to be like that. I used to drive like
Yeah.
that. And then when I started meditating and this sort of thing, I started going like, okay, hang on a second. Like, it is actually possible to localize and identify what cluster of emotions and what cluster of motivations when inside your fucking head are causing you to do
Yeah.
this, to put like your life in the hands of the foot of the brakes of the person in
Yeah.
front of
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And not only that, but clearly spike your cortisol and be perpetually spiked. Because I used to have like the worst rage issues. Like frequent sighting would be Stan in his car parked somewhere, the car shaking back and forth, and me going fuck, fuck,
Yeah.
fuck, God, fucking damn it, slamming on shit. No more. That's and that took just Sam Harris puts it right, noticing what you in fact notice
Yeah,
from moment to
yeah,
moment.
definitely. And being honest, like sometimes I'll have this kind of almost like an ill feeling, and it's only when you drill into it you realize that it's some trivial task that you've failed at, like to get the
Yeah,
guts to actually do, like call somebody that you have to call about an appointment, which you just don't want to do for some reason, and the
right,
inadequacy loops back on itself and makes you feel
right,
really horrible about something. And as soon as you actually identify it, it becomes such a it just collapses, doesn't it, as a problem? You're like, oh well, I've just got to call them because all I've got to do to get rid of this problem is to call somebody. Okay, well that's a lot better than the alternative, which is this. you know?
right. This gnawing sickness, and
Ooh.
and I think 90% of shitty feeling is entirely superficial.
Yeah.
Is just these like task manager tasks that we haven't put away and we're not even looking at, and we don't realize that they're there, and they end up building up to this point where we start feeling like, oh fuck, like something's really wrong with me, or I'm diseased, but then just the moment you examine them, they vaporize, and then you're kind of left with this weird, like, you know, almost blue-balled feeling of like, wait, I thought my problems were deeper. I
Yeah,
thought there
yeah,
was
yeah,
more
yeah.
there. There's nothing.
You're actually kind of a shallow person, not the deep, thoughtful, I'm watching the plastic bag float around in the air currents, man.
Right, right.
And in fact, it's mostly just gamer rage. Yeah.
Then you start paying attention to that feeling, and then you so yeah, you can get really good at this shit, and I think that that's an entire spectrum that for people like my friend is missing. They don't even realize you can begin to analyze in that direction. They've only been analyzing, the rational and the logical, which is a misnomer, because this is the thing is what is it? It takes 7 numbers to completely occupy your prefrontal
Yeah,
cortex,
something like that.
right?
Or 3 seconds of video
Right,
or 10 seconds of sound or something like that. So you can remember a phone number,
right.
basically. Yeah.
Yeah, that's it. And then you're done. Your processor, you're supposedly, this magnificent logic maker, is
Yeah.
cooked. you know and there's a reason that, like, we thought it would take forever to have AI do this, that, and the other thing, and we figured out, oh, getting them to beat chess players is easy, getting them to walk is impossible. Getting them to recognize a smile versus a frown is impossible. Not impossible, but really hard. You know what I mean? And yeah, that landscape becomes so much more interesting. And I think that a lot of engineers and a lot of guys, a lot of men, specifically men, um, just don't have the equipment from the get-go, because they've never been taught. It's never been
Hmm.
emphasized to do that, to manage that. Um, I think, and again, we're talking about bell curves, right? In aggregate, I think women tend to have uh, a few more tools in the toolbox to begin working on that,
That's
right?
certainly always
And
been the role that has been assigned, and therefore it doesn't sound completely implausible to think that maybe there's a slightly larger volume of some piece of brain that processes this stuff in women. I have no idea whether that's the case. I certainly read a lot that there are no concrete. If you were to analyze a brain, there's no definite way of telling whether it came from a man or a woman. Sometimes, you could
yeah,
say that on average, men's brains are slightly like they're physically larger, but there's no other way you could kind of cut it in half and say this is definitely a man's brain or this is definitely a woman's brain.
yes,
It's a bit of a
agreed,
myth,
agreed.
you
And
know.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Which is
absolutely.
interesting
And
to
but
me personally, considering that I'm on this transition from socially male to socially female, based on this kind of strong, persistent intuition that is what my brain wants to do. It's quite interesting to start finding out that maybe in many of the cases, apart from gender identity, this idea that there's a male and a female brain is much more the product of the environment than the inbuilt kind of DNA code or anything like that.
right, and I wouldn't be surprised. I wouldn't be surprised if the difference, as you're saying, is so incredibly marginal, is so tiny, but that because we're brains, right? What does a brain do? Like, how do you walk? You learn to walk because your neural network is extracting tiny hits from
Right.
misses out of an enormous, enormous pool of motor
Hmm.
information, right? So when you look at babies, they're just randomly reaching around, right? They're just randomly until they start to identify specific thoughts with specific movements. This is 0.01% marginal extraction that's going on, right? I mean, there's an economy in your brain that's just carefully trying to assign some pathway one way or another. And I think that the difference between male and female, I really think, and I think this is what culture is. I think that in aggregate, it's like a mile high needle tipped over a centimeter off center to the left or to the
Hmm.
right, and the brain simply finds that centimeter. Is it on the left or is it on the right? And starts uh, exaggerating it,
Mm.
right? That's because that's what a neural network is. A neural network is an exaggeration
Right.
machine. It's a prediction
Hmm.
machine and an
It's like it's
exaggeration
doing
machine.
science, isn't it? It's like it's doing experiments. Like, what happens if I do this? This is the
Right.
result. Let's build on that piece of information. Even though I don't know what the image is, I can start to figure it out that smiles all tend to share these characteristics without even knowing what a smile is. And that's kind of the key to machine
Right.
learning, isn't it?
Yeah, you're shunting it through a hierarchy.
Right.
You're creating buckets and layers of hierarchy. Now, obviously, this very mechanism is the root of superstition and the root of all sorts of bullshit and
Yeah.
bad connection making, because we're so good at extracting content from
Yeah.
noise,
Yeah.
even
Pareidolia.
when it's not
Yeah. I
there.
mean, I start to think that uh, in the same way that technology like cooking enabled us to become what we are now in terms of what we think of as human, i.e., we didn't need big claws because we could use metal utensils to cut our food, which had been softened by cooking, allowed us to have a
Right.
larger brain pan. And this kind of reinforced, that back on itself. Same with having like a better, more protein available
Hmm.
diet because you cook meat, you can get more blah, blah, blah out of it. That also took place with superstition and religion. So, we evolved
Yeah.
into using religion and it conferring survival benefit on a group, and that then was folded back into the babies that were selected for by nature to
Hmm.
survive and carry on. As kind of like we've evolved to be religious in the same way that we've evolved to cook our food. It's almost as if it's
Yeah,
not
yeah,
some superficial thing.
and it also, yeah, exactly. It's exactly right. It also fed into gender
Yeah,
identity,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like
Hmm.
that feedback loop create. So there's two great words that I really like. There's allopatric and sympatric
Okay.
speciation. Have you heard of these terms? So they're I learned them when I went to this. Dan Dennett.
I know who he is. I've seen some of his YouTubes. Yeah.
So I actually met Dan Dennett at this fucking
No
conference
way.
I went to.
Cool.
Yeah, no, he's like 7 feet tall. He's a fucking Wookiee. He's ridiculous. Um, but John's cracking up. So no, he is. He's like Santa Claus. He's enormous. Anyway, um, I got to listen to this cool lecture, and then went next door and listened to this other lecture where they were talking about sympatric and allopatric
Hmm.
speciation.
Sounds Irish.
So it does, doesn't it?
Oh,
Sympatric
allopatric.
speciation. Hello, Patrick. Some good old fashioned family porn right across the border to Wisconsin. Come on. So this I now this is where I get dumb. Is I don't remember which one's which. I can look it up. Um, but the difference is that uh, I think sympatric speciation is the kind of speciation that happens because a river splits a population in two,
Okay.
right? Or basically any kind of speciation that happens because um, the population, the gene pool, is physically
Okay.
separated from
Okay.
itself,
Yep.
right? So some kind of natural bifurcation happens, and this allows gene frequencies to move independently, of their parent
Right.
group. And then allopatric speciation is the kind of speciation that happens in a homogeneous group, meaning tiny differences aggregate inside a population that causes behavioral changes, and self-selective grouping starts to happen. So there's no geographic necessity. There's no need for a river or
Hmm.
whatever. This is literally just uh, starting with random gene frequencies, and then as patterns emerge, those patterns clump. And so soon, behaviorally, and this is, you see this a lot, like with ring species and stuff like that, where creatures are very close to each other initially, or where they're hybridized. and they could mate. Like you could even produce viable offspring, but they just never mate with each other because of this marginal behavioral
So they just
difference.
stop
And
finding
then,
each other hot, basically. They're just not sexually.
yeah,
Interesting.
exactly. Yeah, isn't that interesting? So I think something like that is happening
Yeah.
constantly with
Hmm.
everything, right? That you don't always, and well, and since both are happening, that's adding an additional stirring to the
Hmm.
pot that does something interesting. But yeah, you can get speciation just in a group if you leave a group alone. You know, I also think that this sort of thing is there are accelerants. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? Like the internet is an incredible sexual selection accelerant.
Hmm.
Because it permits people through, say, online dating and whatnot to very, 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 way more rapidly than nature ever allowed for people to go, yes, no, 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 yes, no, no, maybe, no, no. You
Hmm.
know what I mean? We've never, and not just the internet, but also just, cities and mega
Yeah, cities in
populations.
particular. Yeah.
That's kind of a unique situation that we haven't been in until
And
recently.
presumably there.
I don't know if you
Go
heard
on.
oh, go ahead. No,
I
no,
was just
no,
going to
go
say, I
ahead.
wonder if that the most dominant effect is that allows people to select more the thing that they like the most, and therefore narrow the kind of potential for hybridization, or whether it allows people to have a larger pool to access, and therefore choices that they would never, like in their village, would never have been able to make before. I wonder, presumably, as you say, there's all of these different effects all laid on top of each other.
I wouldn't be surprised if what's happening is uh, you had sympatric uh, grouping due to just geographic changes, right? So people formed culture and society and gene pools just by virtue of the fact that people
Hmm.
left Africa, right? So all this splotchiness happens, um, and then with cities, transportation, and the internet, yes, you're having people in villages now get to broaden their mating pool selection. All sorts of stuff happens. But what if you let that continue? It's almost like a tweening, right? Like in Flash, where what's now happening is that it's gonna do the same thing, but it's got to move through itself to form a new shape. Do you know what I'm getting at? Kind of. I'm not sure if I'm describing this well. In other words, maybe there's another optimum,
Right.
right, that exists that now everything is sort of passing through itself to achieve,
If,
right? So in the moment, it feels like, oh, it's a melting pot,
mhm.
it's a mixing pot, but it's not. It's mixing momentarily to
It's
then
more like a
unmix
sorting
again.
effect than a mixing, almost like you filtering.
Right, right. It's just that now the thing that's being sorted is maybe less obvious, right? Is certain behavioral traits. Uh, there's at Berkeley there was a fuck, God, I'm like a million things are popping into my head. One that I don't know if you listened to the David Deutsch Sam Harris
No,
conversation.
I haven't heard that
Some
one yet.
really
No, but
interesting
I
shit
remember
happened.
they were talking about it in another of his podcasts, so that I'll get to that.
Yeah, it's good eats. But there was a really, I gotta remember the book. So something that my other friend Alex said he's been doing, and I was able to do this in Berkeley, and I want to try and do this more now that we're in LA, like find something similar. So uh, in Berkeley, there was a
Hmm.
university library, right? There were many university libraries, and one of the things that I really like about a university library is that you have the general library, where it's like, oh, come and
Hmm.
get every kind of book. But then you have topic specific libraries, like, the library of, Far East Studies, or whatever it is, or the library of the natural sciences, or the library of the zoological department, right? Um, and so we went to there's this library that was for the biology department at UC
Hmm.
Berkeley, okay? First of all, really, really cool because there's like a Triceratops skeleton in the front and all kinds of neat shit. But then you go inside and you find uh, like every like I don't know if the topic is like how bats fuck, you're gonna find every book published on the topic of bat fucking in every language. You know, like the entire Chinese encyclopedia of bat fucking. You know, up and it'll stretch. You know, like an entire bookshelf across. You know what I mean? Like that kind of level of stuff. And so I found this textbook um, that talked about the evolution of
Okay.
gender and blew my fucking mind because it was like mostly about iguanas,
Right.
right? In a lot of places, at least as far as I can remember, or at least maybe it was just the chapter I was reading was about iguanas. But it was talking, it was talking kind of about the, uh, uh, well, first of all, it was a textbook, so it was talking
Right.
about goddamn everything about this topic. So it was very broad. And the other, you know, not to meander too much. Thanks, Joan. Um, was that I'm just starting to realize how awesome
Yeah.
textbooks are.
Yeah. I know
Textbooks
what
are
you
really
mean.
good. Uh, so my other friend Alex was telling me that he's just completely abandoned even like um, regular nonfiction books and just goes to textbooks now. You know, it's just like why I'll just go read the textbook about architecture or about I don't know bat fucking. But the 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 cool thing was it was full of all this really interesting information about the game theory of
Okay.
zygotes,
Hmm.
right? Like, so this is where I wonder about, where that overlap is. And again, here we are, two concept artists talking out of our ass without the
Naturally.
requisite PhDs, but um, which is a perfect kind of conversation to have. Um, I started really kind of wondering, like, how do is there's the whole thing about the rare egg and the
Right.
ubiquitous sperm, right? And the kind of the thing that happens there, which is thanks, Joe, which is in animal behavior, whichever organism has the rare zygote, um, has to guard that zygote and has to behave. This is like classic
It's
evolutionary
economics,
psychology
isn't it?
type
It's
of
supply and
bullshit.
demand.
But what's interesting though is that um, in they've run supercomputer simulations of this where uh, when you have an organism starting to evolve the
Hmm.
capacity for sex, which loosely described is combining more than one individual's
Hmm.
genome to
Hmm.
form a new organism, right? So when this starts to happen, first, it's not necessary that you have two sexes immediately. You can have five sexes. You can have, all sorts of absurd numbers of sexes. But what happens is that over time, if it doesn't just collapse to asexual reproduction again, depending on the environment, it always stabilizes on two sexes, one with a cheap, numerous zygote and one with a rare,
Hmm.
expensive zygote. Always
Just because
converges
it's the
to this.
cheapest, it's the one that
Isn't that weird?
it confers the most survival benefit in that you have to invest the least energy or something. There's some statistical pressure favoring that.
Right. There's
Right.
some forcing function that
Right.
always pushes in those two directions. Isn't that weird? Mm. And so then, and now I'm realizing I'm totally fucking forgetting what the hell this textbook was about in relation to this topic. Anyway, it was really fucking
Because
cool,
I mean,
and textbooks are great.
I completely get where you're coming from there. I'd often wondered why they bothered with sex, why life bothered at all, because bacteria been doing quite well without it, perfectly fine. But it's as you say,
Mm-hmm.
this recombination seems to be almost like a way of fighting. I mean, the theory that I read was that in the biosphere in the days when sex was brand new, basically life was constantly under attack from what's effectively malware, just bits of code that replicate because they replicate because they
Right.
replicate, and if they happen to be good at inserting themselves into genomes, then they replicate it. Exactly what we have now resulted in things like viruses, which are very specialized, sophisticated versions of these things, which then, of course, we then
Yeah.
named computer viruses after, and then recreated this early viral world in the internet, if you like. That this is what sex was one of the ways of just
Yeah.
uh, error checking, so that you didn't have these disruptive bits of genetic information inserting themselves too easily. That to me was a really interesting kind of reason that you would go to all of this trouble and all of this energy expenditure just to sort out the errors that
Yeah.
have been introduced by this relentless sort of um, viral attack. In both senses of the word viral, chemical, and viral informational.
Yeah. 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 No, it's actually kind of amazing the lengths to which that copy me program
Mm-hmm.
has gone to ensure its ultimate function, right? Like, what was it that Richard Dawkins' book? I forgot which book it was, but he's like, an elephant is a copy me program. It just says copy me,
Yeah,
but build an
completely.
elephant
I
first.
mean, it's just favored by
You know?
the universe, isn't it? The ones that win the question of how to survive, try and survive, and the ones that win are the ones that do, and the ones that outcompete the other ones. It's a tautology, isn't it? It's so kind of fundamental.
Yeah. Well, so that makes me wonder. I hope you don't mind me munching. I know you did the politeness of eating first before getting on the phone. Um, but I'm an American. I'm an asshole, so whatever. But
And picking like the food I just ate before we called out of my teeth. So please,
um, so, oh my God, fuck! I lost my train of thought. What was I just saying?
see what you think of this. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
where to begin? Okay, so in large populations, so many mutations arise that will counteract the effect of the harmful genes that have been inserted by these kind of sub-life scale bits, like bits of self-replicating DNA that they're not quite life forms; they're just kind of bits of malware. So there's no need to resort to this style of recombination because the population is like a bacteria constantly swapping genes, and that error checks it automatically. But in a small population, sex is favoured, and this is why it became the norm for the first eukaryotes because
yeah.
their populations were so tiny. That was the only reason that sex was something that became so widespread. It's just because it was there at the very small population at the start. I think that's a really interesting metaphor for all sorts of things apart from the joy of sex. The beginnings a delicate
Mm-hmm.
time. It's really interesting to me.
Yeah. Oh fuck! You brought Dune into
There's
this.
not a
God damn.
conversation I can't
Um,
bore people with how awesome June is about. Divert anything into
well,
June.
having
Happy
just read it,
birthday,
it's not
Grandma. By
like.
the way, June, I just bought you June. Check it out. It's good.
No, here's the interesting thing about what you just read that just struck me is uh so developing sex is a population
Hmm.
survival trick
Yeah,
for tiny populations, right? Um, and especially populations where the environment changes
yeah.
frequently.
And once it's
That's
evolved, it
that's
doesn't.
the other thing I read
It's very
today.
difficult to go back. I mean, there are some sort of there are
Right.
aphids. I think that there are creatures, fish. Some of them they've developed these sophisticated ways of kind of playing around with the rules of the male and the female, and as we
Right.
just talked about in humans now, technology is starting to do this, but like at least in a social, if not a reproductive sense. But yeah, mostly once it's happened, there's no going back. It's kind of fundamental.
Well, so then the thought is okay. So now so they develop sex.
Hmm.
They're eukaryotes, right? Or eukaryotic colonies, or whatever minimum necessary mechanism is to develop sex. Then you have that whatever that economic forcing function is that make sure that you have the one expensive rare zygote and the numerous
Hmm.
inexpensive zygote, right? Then you have another forcing function, which is protect the
Right.
expensive zygote. How do you protect the expensive zygote? You need equipment, right? So one could argue that the proliferation of multicellular complex life has been driven by the female of the species,
So the male,
right? Because the male
right?
has to catch up, right? The female is building the defenses to protect the expensive zygote, meaning skeleton and
Anglerfish, you
muscle.
see the male becoming a sort of vestigial parasite of the female, just a sperm manufacturing
Right,
organ of the female. Interesting.
right, exactly. So, and now what happens is you get, you let that run long enough, you get the interesting situation of like peacocks, right? I have this really cheap zygote, right? But I have
Yeah,
to
yeah,
convince you that
yeah,
it's
uh-huh.
a pricey, awesome thing, right? I
Yeah.
basically have to do a bait and switch. You know what I mean? I have to put on a show. I have to, spend
Hmm.
all these calories on this
Hmm.
absurd headdress and feathers mm, to convince you that I'm not selling you coal, or
And it's
bottles
not
or whatever. You
always.
know what I
It's in
mean?
fact, it's not ever the thing that is like they have to survive, but the main task is to be sexually attractive, isn't it? As if that's the thing that's important rather than the
Right,
survival. And so it's almost as if that's where this idea of beauty has come from, isn't it? This kind of mixture of being good at surviving, but also having enough time and energy to like put more effort into, more aesthetic pursuits. Having beautiful feathers or making a like beautiful nest or driving a nice car or writing a beautiful poem or any of this other stuff. It's
right,
almost as if that's what's that's where it first began, because obviously bacteria have no real preference, they have no choice, whereas sexual selection, particularly in, as you were saying, like tournament species that compete aggressively every year, that kind of what the girl finds beautiful is, as you say, really important in driving the whole shape of the body of both halves of the species.
right. Well, so this is where humans are so weird because and I remember the point from the David Deutsch thing with Sam Harris that I wanted to insert into this, which was so you have this forcing function that's driving
Hmm.
males to be better liars. To be a better liar means you have to have more natural
Hmm.
abilities to bullshit. But having more natural abilities to bullshit is expensive and difficult, right? Because
Hmm.
you also need to not die, right? Um, and so then females now are driven in another direction, which is that their defenses have to be what? Perceptive. They have
Okay.
to
Yeah.
see through the bullshit.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You have to your brain power has to increase. You have to be more sensitive. You have to be more sensitive. You have to be a more sensitive instrument because it's going to be very difficult to discern, the uh, uh, the bullshit from the guy who maybe there's some quality that
Hmm.
represents the kind of gene you want to copulate with or whatever. You know what I mean? But a, with certain creatures like social creatures, right? Um, dimorphism can only go so far,
Hmm.
right? Because social creatures need to be largely similar enough to one another that the group functions.
That certainly seems to be confirmed by the things that instantly come off the top of my head, like wolves, parrots, dolphins. They're all roughly similar
Right.
in size and shape, the
Whereas,
male and the female.
right, they may have slightly different coloration and whatnot, but you look at usually sexual dimorphism is the most dramatic in species that are not particularly social, right? And so what happens is that you have a function now that goes, well, whatever advantage the female is getting may also be
Oh yeah,
leaking into the
obviously. I
male
mean,
gene
that's
pool,
that's that's clearly the case,
right?
and that certainly is a great explanation for things like homosexuality in humans. Is that
Yeah,
parents that give birth to girls that are really well adapted for reproduction also tend to give birth to men that are gay, and the package is expressed in those two different ways. But that's so
yeah.
there's no need for male
Fuck,
homosexuality. It's just a kind of what's the word? Is it corollary or contingency of the result of the thing that's being specialized for in the female. The female is the important one. The male one is just a kind of side effect.
it's sort of like a the extended phenotype of that, right? So it's like with the foxes, when they breed foxes for tameness, they also develop floppy ears and black and white spots.
Oh, how interesting is that? Because all of the fear generation infrastructure is reduced in volume, and that includes stuff like the ears, the what's the stuff inside bone that's not bone, sinew or gristle.
Well, you
What's
know
the
what
word
it
I'm
is?
looking for? The
The
stuff that ears are
cartilage,
made
yeah.
of is less strong when you reduce the fear generating infrastructure from ear to nerve to brain. All of that is reduced, and you get a much more placid animal, and their ears flop down just as a kind of, like you say, a side effect. Amazing.
Right, right. Isn't that incredible? Yeah, because ultimately everything in your body is just sort of like a hack, right? Like it's not because it's not
Yeah.
intelligently designed, right? It's you don't know what system is doing double or triple duty for some other system.
Yeah. And the more you drill into it, that is the case at every level of the
Yeah,
structure, isn't it? From the shape of genes to the behavior of genes to how cells work to organs to
yeah,
ideas.
yeah.
Yeah. It's always that kind of, is it functional or does it just come as a package with something that's functional? Like the example they use in those YouTube videos by Sapolsky is, is it an arch, which is a functional thing, or a spandril, which is the sort of gap that you get between two arches just as a
Right.
result of there being a gap there.
Yeah, it's and then you have a machine that's building irreducibly complex machines all the time.
Yeah, yeah. And often those spandrels then, because they're there, find a new function that then becomes really useful. Like there's tons of examples of stuff that just happened as a result of something else that then found its own. For example, what was it? Oh yeah, so metaphorical thought tends to be when you're talking about how you feel about ideas. Things are tasteful, things are disgusting,
Yeah,
things are sickening, things are bitter, things are memories are sweet.
yeah. Oh my God, that's
Defeat is bitter. Often these ideas are in terms of taste because the part of the brain that processes taste was also co-opted by part of our higher mind, almost because it was in a straight line between two other things. It would just pass
right.
through that, and that's why we end up talking in metaphorical terms about things like a
So,
sickening act or a sweet reward or anything like that.
so this perfectly ties into the thing that David Deutsch was saying, which I actually forgot what earlier were. No, okay, yeah. Okay. So David Deutsch was saying that um, when you
Mm-hmm.
look at humanity, right, uh, in our modern form, we've been in this modern form for roughly say let's say the conservative
Okay.
estimate is 250,000 years, right, as Homo
Mm-hmm.
sapiens, but it could be longer, right? Um, so we pretty much have had the ability to use slide rules and put people on the moon and create symphonies and like that's all been there for 250,000 years.
I don't know if I believe that because it certainly seems to be that, yeah, okay, even very far back, things were very sophisticated. We were burying our dead and making large, non-functional in terms of
Yeah.
material use buildings that happen, maybe it's ceremonial in function. But just because we physically were looking very similar, I don't think the stuff that the micro scale stuff in the brain is going to be preserved.
Well,
And I don't know. I mean, computers looked a lot like they did in the 80s, and they still. I don't know.
it's true, but uh, uh, so let's
But yeah, okay,
let's
yeah.
grant it for a second. Let's pretend that maybe it was the same. His argument was that this was actually a tragedy of culture,
Huh.
that we basically had a shitty culture for 250,000 years. And then only in the last 5,000 years did the, almost by accident, did, we start kind of migrating sufficiently enough that the environments we encountered forced new kinds of specialization that we had
Out
never
of our
done.
comfort
So it
zone.
was
Just get
basically,
kicked out
we
of your
had all
comfort
this
zone and
hardware.
learn all these new
Yeah,
things or die. Yeah.
right. So we, in other words, we had all this hardware. It was just being deployed for largely the same problems over and over again, right? And that we had a kind of cultural lock-in due to the fact that our environment remained largely stable for a very long time.
It really makes you pine for like the 190,000 years of history we'll never
Right.
know. Because I mean, if these were people same as you and me, more or less, there's like tens and tens of thousands of years of empires and stories and tribes and
Right.
villages and river, expeditions and stuff that we'll just never know
Yeah, they're
about. And
gone.
I'm like, God damn it, that's gone forever.
It's
We'll never
completely
know.
vaporized.
And what yeah, because I mean, if people have been living in Africa for 150,000 years in a row, that's a pretty heavily ramified culture. I mean, that's culture that's old in a way that ours doesn't begin to even compare
Right.
to, doesn't it? Our culture's what, 10,000, 15,000 years old, really?
Right.
And it seems. But it's built upon these much, much more long-lived things. It's almost like an alien empire that we'll never know.
Well, that's the thing that makes me go crazy is I wonder, like, what it's easy enough to say, like, oh well, it wasn't until we discovered this or that, but why didn't we
Mm.
discover it for such a long time? Why why did we go 150,000 years before someone was like, yeah, fuck this, I'm leaving? You know what I mean? Like, that maybe there were people poking and probing for a long time, and I mean, it could be that we're underestimating how improbable survival outside of our environment was until someone figured it out. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, it could be that the size and scale of Africa itself has an enormous effect that we will never know about. But yeah, if we'd evolved on Australia, maybe we would have had a very different shape. I don't know. I mean, I lost my train of thought there just thinking about that. But carry on. I'll come back to what I was going to say.
No, no,
Oh,
that's
I
okay.
know what it was. It
Well,
was the UK. The UK had been
we should.
colonized nine
Yeah.
different times, and only the eighth stuck. The other ones had been driven out
Oh,
by
really?
ice ages or whatever, and the remnants was that it was scraped almost clean, but we can still have enough evidence to figure out who these people were and where they came from, where they went. And this is the ninth time was the ones that preceded the Anglo-Saxons and the Picts and whoever 9,000, 10,000 years ago. Over and over again, this
Oh,
was
shit.
tried. Yeah.
Yeah, they tried. God, that's crazy. And that's just the,
And
yeah, that's crazy. Like, yeah,
on one level, that's just like gas diffusing into a new space that's opened off the room that it's in, particles just browning into that space. But on another level, on a human level, that's huge adventures and, this guy leading the tribe and these guys
right,
splitting off because they're more right wing and, these guys don't want to do it, blah, blah, blah. Just the same amount of
right.
interest as what we have today in our world.
See, that's the kind of shit that makes me want to, you know, I mean, for lack of it, just read more history. Like, I feel like I'm so constantly forward looking and have just not appreciated the volume of existing adventures and information that there are to consume and the insight therein. Like, I need to read more history.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, I certainly, I'm very thankful that one of my friends put me on to Dan
Oh yeah,
Carlin's
yeah,
history things because they really give you a sense of just how long history has already been and how many times things just like what we in the world now are very similar have occurred before over and over, and how
yeah,
your life is just this tiny pixel in this giant
yeah.
image, giant moving image. It really does make you feel terrifyingly small at times. I think it's like watching
Yeah.
a river go down a hill, and each person is like a molecule in that river. It's just this huge system.
Yeah, when you really dive into history, like you get a almost like a Hyperion level or Dune level sense of the immense, like Earth itself becomes a galaxy. You know what I mean? Like it's like, oh shit.
And that's where the call dropped. So after that, we just talked about work. But I hope you enjoyed that. Next month, I'm really looking forward to having a three-way discussion between me and Stan and special guest Matthias Verhasselt, one of my absolute favourite concept artists, who is also a super, super bright guy and full of interesting stuff to talk about. So I'm really looking forward to that. Please join us. I think it should be really good fun. So till then, bye.